perhaps slightly more orthodox Pele. But first off, I'd like to thank Pele for outlining the important work he's doing with his colleagues in Malmo. In my response to Pele, I'd like to explore the import of actor network theory, which I'm going to call ANT from now on, and its developments of participatory design, something that Pele and his colleagues are clearly working on in their approach to the Living Lab model of innovation. In particular, I want to highlight the way in which participants and designers can change their identity and competencies within the design process, what actor network theory refers to as the translation of roles. In conclusion, I will draw out some discussion points which I would like to address to Pele and the audience about these developments in participatory design and its entanglements with actor network theory, ANT. So perhaps one of the successes of ANT and SDS more broadly has been to dispel what, after Foucault, might be called the author function that has operated so effectively in accounts of invention and innovation, as well as design. Reflecting the commitments of the Scandinavian tradition of participatory design, accounts of the dynamics of technology from an ANT perspective have demonstrated the involvement of what Michel Calon calls hybrid communities, where, for example, diverse actors, such as organizations, developers, users, and technologies, participate in bringing into being new technologies and new socio-material practices. ANT provides us with numerous case studies that can be read in terms of the involvement of hybrid communities in the development of new technologies, including the design and development of an electric vehicle, the development of a fully autonomous public transportation system, the design of a civic website in Amsterdam, the role of smart homes in innovation, and the design of kitchen appliances, to name but a few. Likewise, participatory design has demonstrated a commitment to the socio-material collectives that can participate in the development of new technologies, such as the cardboard mock-up of a desktop laser printer deployed as part of the Utopia project that Pele mentioned before, to envision new workplace relations between typographers and journalists. Closer one. I'd like the original Pele. So clearly then...
It's lost.
So clearly then in ANT and PD, the status of non-humans in the design process for some time been foregrounded, whether in empirical studies of technological development, the advancement of industrial democracy, and the support of skilled workers in the workplace, or, as Pele has described today, the work he's now doing in Malmo with the grassroots hip-hop youth organisation, RGRA, and the Hergards Women Association, part of the Malmo Living Labs initiative. For Michel Calon, the broader implications of an ANT-informed approach to participatory design are as follows. Firstly, people and technology are formatted in design and not prefigured. Secondly, people's identities and competencies are diverse and a consequence of particular socio-technical orderings. And thirdly, participatory design is engaged in the configuring of new capacities and reformatting the existing capacities. Oh, there's a fourth one. And finally, what's at stake with participatory design is the type of agencies that we want to develop, and not limited to market models of human agencies such as the economic subject that Michel spoke about previously. So one concrete illustration of these implications drawn from Pele's work includes the way in which the relations between members of the Hergards Women Association, including Afghani, Iraqi, Iranian, Bosnian women, and newly arrived refugee children from Afghanistan were transformed by way of the cooking experiment. In collaboration with the Swedish healthcare organisation, representatives of the Women's Association provided the children with home-cooked meals. Here in particular, new competencies and identities were formatted in the design process. The refugee children, for example, start to make new demands to be cooked for by the Women's Association on a daily basis, and the women themselves are reconfigured under the auspices of the Swedish health and safety regulations pertaining to the provision of catering services. Here then is one example of how the roles, identities and competencies of participants are translated during the design process. That is to say, how actors are defined in relation to one another. Another example of how the roles of participants can be left open to translation by both designers and participants is not paying participants for their involvement. What ostensibly might be viewed as an unequal economic relationship where the participant is divested of rightful financial reward implied in the development of new products and services can also be understood as a strategy for not over-determining participation through short-term financial gain. Instead, not paying participants enables them, in the words of Thomas Binder, a colleague of Pele, to simply walk out the door. Put differently, the role of participants can be open to contingent transformation. This example of how participants can change their role also points to the invisible nitty-gritty of design work. So drawing on my own research, I also witnessed the many translations of participants as part of user-centered design processes, an approach to design closely associated with participatory design. One example of this is the way an elderly man suffering from type 2 diabetes was the subject of an in-home interview carried out to inform the development of an interactive device for persons suffering from chronic disease. Due to the unruliness of the way in which he managed his diabetes alongside other chronic illnesses he was suffering from, the elderly man was first translated into a prospective user, then into a non-user. In other words, the interviewee embodied a case of situated medico-technological practices that did not fit with the designer's model of the future user. However, despite initially being classified as a non-user, aspects of data derived from the interview endured in the design process. So what I've highlighted on so far, or concentrated on, is how participants can be transformed or translated during participatory design processes, occasionally new socio-technical practices, and new ways of being with technology. Having established this, I now want to add a fifth implication to Callum's view of participatory design, namely that the role of designers is open to translation during the design process. In other words, if the identity and competencies of participants are configured during participatory design practices, then the identity and capacities of designers is also open to change. This points to questions around how designers emerge as implicated actors in design innovation processes. Again, drawing on my own research, I want to briefly describe a translation that I underwent conducting my fieldwork. In this instance, the process by which I was inducted into a multinational ICT corporation, the setting for my ethnographic studies of user-centered designers. To gain access to my field, I was obliged to be employed as an intern within the corporation, acting as a user interface designer. It was my training and experience as an interaction designer that provided me with ongoing access to my field. However, to first gain entry, I had to undergo a 5-hour process of new employee orientation, known as NEO, as an induction into the culture of the corporation, which began at 7:30 in the morning. Practically, this meant reading and signing various forms, including numerous legal obligations and agreements. It meant witnessing presentations about the corporation's history, culture, values, and approach to ICT development and innovation in general. And it also meant aligning myself with the corporation's version of time that you can see on this is the ID card I was given, where they split the year up into work weeks. Perhaps obviously though, through this process as a designer, as an ethnographer, the power relations between the corporation and myself are being formatted, including contractual agreements pertaining to intellectual property and to health and safety in the workplace. Thus, in the context of the corporation, I was being formatted as a skilled and embodied innovation actor to be deployed in user-centered design practices that would align with corporate culture and strategy. This example of my role as a designer is somewhat fixed by virtue of my various relations with the corporation, but it also points to ways to think about looser or more flexible accountabilities. So, just to sort of tie it all together, some concluding remarks. I'd like to open up a discussion about ways of thinking about how designers, as well as participants, co-emerge and themselves transform during participatory design processes. As I've suggested in my brief discussion, many accounts of PD focus on the interventions to participants, such as typesetters, journalists, members of youth organisations, and a women's association, as well as refugee children. Here, the question I want to ask is, following Lucy Suchman and her notion of located accountabilities, is what of the designers in this approach to participatory design? What ways do we have for understanding the ongoing transformation that designers undergo and their accountability during these processes? To paraphrase another colleague of Pele, how could he account for being an ethnographer, a designer, a roadie, and an administrator, amongst other roles whilst working with the hip hop organisation? Or in other words, how do designers continually locate themselves, and how do these locations emerge as accountable? Indeed, are there absences from accountability? And that's what I'd like to conclude.